Today we're going to take a step back in time and discover some of Victoria's most remarkable gold mining history, nestled away in this picturesque alpine valley. Beautifully restored and maintained, Walhalla is a must-see destination where you can take a trip on the stunning Walhalla Goldfields Railway, head underground on a guided mine tour, explore the town's charming stores and museums, and enjoy the natural beauty of the region. You can even set out on a ghost tour after dark. As you may have guessed, this gorgeous town owes its existence to the same thing as many others across Victoria: gold. Originally a mining settlement known as Stringer's Creek, this soon became one of the richest places in Victoria. One of the most successful of the early gold mines here was named Walhalla, and the town took its name when it was surveyed in 1866, becoming Walhalla as we know it today. So how did it all begin? Well, the year was 1862. It was 11 years since the onset of the Victorian gold rush and not long after the discovery of the Jordan and Woods Point goldfields. Ex-convict Ned Stringer had been exploring the Aberfeldy and Thompson rivers with his mates when they began to prospect for gold in what would soon be called Stringer's Creek. They came upon a rich patch, and in early 1863, Ned rushed back to Bald Hills to register a creek claim. Not surprisingly, a trail of opportunistic gold diggers followed him back. Word of the new goldfield spread fast, and despite the remote and unforgiving location, Stringer's Creek was soon alive with the workings of cradles and tin dishes, as crowds of busy diggers worked the rich river gravels for gold. It only took a few weeks for experienced prospectors to discover the source of the alluvial gold. Rich quartz had been outcropping on the steep ground above, eroding its golden treasures into the creek below. A rich seam of quartz was outcropping for a great distance along the side of the valley and was named Cohen's Reef, after John Cohen, a storekeeper at Bald Hills. The story goes that Cohen traded a £5 note and a bottle of whiskey in exchange for having the reef named after him. Ground was claimed and work on the reef began. In late 1863, within 1 year of his discovery in the creek, Ned Stringer became seriously ill with tuberculosis. He walked all the way to Sale for medical treatment, but unfortunately never made it back. He died on the return journey and was buried at Toongabbie at just 44 years old. Ned didn't live to see it, but the goldfield he and his mates discovered along Stringer's Creek turned out to be home to the richest reef in Victoria. The now famous Cohen's Reef yielded an incredible 1.5 million troy ounces of gold. Before long, work on the reef required more investment than the small claim holders could provide. So mining companies were registered, capital was raised, and work continued. Of all the mines operating on Cohen's Reef, there were two which would rise above all the rest: the Long Tunnel and the Long Tunnel Extended. The mountainous terrain and the directions Cohen's Reef took underground called for a great deal of innovation and determination on the part of the mining companies, and resulted in some of the most extraordinary mining machinery setups in Victoria. This is the Long Tunnel Extended gold mine, which offers an absolutely unmissable experience where you can take a guided underground tour of this significant historic mine. You'll follow the footsteps of the old-time miners as you venture into the depths of the earth, exploring the mine's many unique and innovative features. In this video, we're going to take a look into the history of the Long Tunnel Extended Gold Mining Company, exploring the methods and machinery used by the mines in Walhalla, some typical of gold mines throughout Victoria, and some truly remarkable. So let's take a look back to the year 1866, when a small company named Hercules was at work on Cohen's Reef. They cut an adit into the hillside, intercepting the reef with disappointing results. After several years of hard work, they ran out of money and wound up. This is where the long tunnel extended entered the scene. The new company took over the small 25-acre lease, which had previously been held by the Hercules United Gold Mining Company. The long tunnel extended set to work in the adit, which is still open today. So let's go in and take a closer look. Here we are, right in the middle of the famous Cohen's Reef. But if this is the richest reef in Victoria, you may be wondering, why is it still here? Well, as Hercules found, this part just didn't have enough gold in it. They had driven along it and didn't find enough to make a profit. But the Long Tunnel Extended Company had a plan. Progress in the early years was incredibly slow going, and production of gold did not even begin until the 1880s. There was no rock drilling machinery here in the early days, and all holes required for blasting were cut using the old hammer and tap method. By the dim light of a tallow candle, one miner held a long iron drill while another smashed it into the rock with a heavy hammer. The drill was rotated, then hammered again. This work went on for the entire shift, and as you can probably imagine, broken bones were among the many risks of the job. Here at the Long Tunnel Extended mine, there is a brilliant surviving example of those hand-drilled holes along the roof of the adit. If you visit for a tour, you'll be treated to an in-depth explanation and demonstration of the hammer and tap method. The introduction of pneumatic rock drills was revolutionary in underground mining. Although the improved drilling technology was a great and profitable development for the mining companies, it came at a terrible cost to the miners who used them. Silicosis, commonly known in those days as miner's complaint, is a fibrosis of the lungs caused by excessive inhalation of silica dust. And where was that dust coming from? Quartz, the very stuff the miners were chasing. Quartz is the most abundant natural form of silica, and it's not only found in reefs. Quartz is also present in the sedimentary rock the miners were tunneling through. Now, the silica dust generated from slowly working with a hammer and tap was bad enough. Imagine how much worse it got when they began using air-powered rock drills down here. Miners who started work underground as teenagers were lucky to live until the age of 30. And if they did, they were considered to be old men, so severe was the effect on their bodies. Developments in rock drilling technology eventually saw the introduction of water through the drill to keep it cool, which also kept the dust down. But countless miners' lives had already been cut tragically short before this development came into play. Back to the gold, or rather lack of it, in this part of the reef. Miners who had tunnelled into Cohen's Reef from down at creek level had been getting good gold, and as this adit had been tunnelled in from much higher ground, the Long Tunnel Extended knew they needed to sink a shaft to reach the rich ore which lay waiting at greater depths. They put down a winze about 60 metres deep to test if the reef improved with depth. Satisfied with the results, they set to work. Cohen's Reef is a highly laminated quartz reef which runs north-south with a westerly dip. The reef is associated with a dike along much of its course, which was intruded into the surrounding slate and sandstone before the quartz reef was deposited. In order to safely mine this reef, the Long Tunnel Extended needed to approach it from the hanging wall side. They planned to put down their shaft a fair distance from the reef on the far side, so they had been busy extending the old Hercules adit. Now, most mines sunk their shafts from the surface and put up large machinery plants for winding, air compression and pumping. Here at the mountainous Walhalla, to cut out a fair amount of work and expense in sinking, at that time it made more sense for some mines to sink their shafts from within adits they cut into the mountainside, eliminating a great deal of expensive sinking from the surface above. But what about all that machinery which was required at the shaft? Well, here's where things got really interesting. A blacksmith shop was put up near the entrance to the mine, and permanent tramway was laid as they prepared to excavate a machinery chamber at the end of the adit, which was extended to 274 metres. All winding and pumping was to be done from underground. And how is this going to be powered? Steam, of course. In the late 1870s, the large underground chamber was completed and timbered, and the previously small adit begun by the Hercules Company was enlarged in order to facilitate the introduction and construction of machinery, including a big Cornish boiler which was installed within the chamber in 1878. Now, in order to get steam from a boiler, you need to keep a fire burning inside it. Can you imagine the heat of an underground boiler room? And where on earth is all that smoke going to go? Well, the long tunnel extended already had it covered. A vertical flue was cut from the machinery chamber 152 metres up through solid rock and lined with brick all the way to the surface. Smoke from the boiler was carried away in the wind from the mountain above. This remarkable flue was a unique feature in Victoria. Along with the boiler, a 55 horsepower pumping engine was supplied by Hallwood and Sons of Sandhurst, and a winding engine was moved from the South Coens mine. The early winding plants used at Walhalla, including at the Long Tunnel Extended, had double drums which were ran by a single engine. Winding cables for raising ore and miners from underground are typically ran over sheave wheels, which are supported by a substantial headframe standing over the shaft. Not much room in here for a poppet head. To solve this problem, a tunnel was cut at an angle through the roof of the machinery chamber alongside the shaft. The winding cables were ran up the tunnel to pulley wheels at the top, then vertically into the main shaft below. Genius. The shaft itself had 3 compartments, 2 for winding and 1 for pumping groundwater out of the mine. So down they went. In 1881, the Long Tunnel Extended introduced a national air compressor and 3 national rock drills. A second boiler was also installed, along with a 40 horsepower Hallwood steam pumping engine. Something else happened in 1881. The Long Tunnel Extended Company struck gold. The reef was opened up 600 feet below the machinery chamber and 75 feet east of the shaft. While the first crushing was hardly satisfactory, yields improved quickly, going from 10 pennyweights to almost 2 ounces a tonne in just over a year. The Long Tunnel Extended Company was trucking out payable ore, but they didn't have a mill to process any of it for gold. So they had an arrangement in place with the neighbouring Long Tunnel Company. The ore raised from underground was hauled out of the adit and conveyed along a tramway by horses to be crushed at one of the Long Tunnel Company's batteries, which was previously owned by the Walhalla Company. There, the ore was dumped into hoppers and put through a 30-head stamp battery at a cost of about £200 a month. The Long Tunnel Extended Company gave consideration to erecting their own mill in 1883. But the cost was not considered to be justifiable, and they continued to send their ore for processing at the neighbouring mine's mill for another 20 years. The reason why this arrangement did eventually stop is a remarkable story in itself, which we'll get to soon enough. Development of the mine continued, and the shaft was progressively deepened, cross-cutting to the reef about every 100 feet. A description of the Long Tunnel Extended appeared in the Argus in 1886, which shared details about the machinery in the chamber at the time. The winder was described as being a 20 horsepower horizontal winding engine made by Cochrane of Glasgow, with 2 winding drums for round wire rope capable of carrying 2,000 feet. The 55 horsepower pumping engine from Horwood & Sons, which was brought in upon construction of the chamber, was still in use. They still had the national air compressor, capable of powering 3 rock drills, and a large air receiver was sunk into the floor of the chamber. A Tangy steam pump fed 2 Cornish boilers. During the 1880s, the mine's first decade of gold production, the Long Tunnel Extended Company produced 103,530 ounces of gold at 1.18 ounces to the tonne. Over £180,000 was paid to the happy shareholders. By 1890, this mine had reached a depth of 1,200 feet. That's a long way underground. As you can imagine, in a mine 1,200 feet deep with many crosscuts and drives, fresh air is going to be an issue. Ventilation in mines has been a subject of great importance in Victoria since the very early days of the gold rush, when miners at Ballarat first put up wind sails to deliver fresh air to those working down below. There are many methods of ventilation in mines, including mechanical blowers, furnaces, and interconnection between mine shafts underground. The Long Tunnel Extended's natural ventilation system was mentioned in the 1891 report of the Royal Commission on Gold Mining. Ventilation was provided by an interconnection between the shafts of the Long Tunnel and the Long Tunnel Extended, providing good ventilation for both mines. The Long Tunnel Extended later cut an inclined ventilation shaft from their machinery chamber, which would certainly have provided some relief from the heat of those huge boilers. In 1893, the northerly pitch of the reef caused the company to sink a blind shaft from number 13 level, from which they worked the next 4 levels with better access to the reef. In 1896, the Long Tunnel Extended was on top of the Victorian mining dividend list. Things were going great for the shareholders. They were now using Taylor Horsfield drills, and by the end of the 1890s, they'd reach a depth of around 2,000 feet in their main shaft. As you may recall, 2,000 feet was all the rope their first winding drums were capable of carrying. It was time for an upgrade. A safer and more efficient first motion winding plant was installed in 1899, which had 2 engines directly connected to the drum shaft. This was installed in a winding chamber to the west of the shaft, opposite the original winder. The 1890s saw the Long Tunnel Extended produce over 170,000 ounces of gold, paying almost £350,000 in dividends. The pumping gear was upgraded in 1901 and again in 1906. Almost all pumps used in Walhalla, including at this mine, were Cornish beam pumps. In 1903, a 300 horsepower Roberts air compressor was installed in the machinery chamber to supply air to the rock drills and pumps. There were 5 boilers underground and air compressors sufficient to drive 26 rock drills. Over time, the machinery chamber was extended to its current size of about 43 metres long, 9 metres wide and 4 metres high to accommodate the additional machinery. The Long Tunnel Extended boasted the largest underground machinery installation in Walhalla. This chamber is a brilliant feature of the guided tour, where you'll be able to explore the fascinating surviving features and learn all about the operation of the mine. You can imagine the heat of the boilers, the hum of the machinery, and the sound of the ore trucks being hauled out of here by horses along the rails. Until the introduction of mechanical haulage, horses were used to pull rakes of trucks in the Long Tunnel Extended at it. Horses used in underground mining were known as pit ponies, and just like the miners, they often worked under very difficult conditions. If you're wondering how they could possibly get these animals underground in mines in anything approaching a comfortable and humane way, well, unfortunately, they didn't. Horses that were sent to lower levels of mines usually stayed down there, with stables constructed underground. There are stories that horses were working in the lower levels of the mines here, and this photo of a horse being lowered down the shaft of an unidentified mine is held in the Walhalla Heritage and Development League's collection of photographs. While it is well known that horses were working in the adits, the question of whether horses were ever lowered down the shafts of the Long Tunnel and Long Tunnel Extended mines is an interesting one. If horses or ponies were working in the lower levels here, level 9 of the Long Tunnel Company would certainly have been where they were needed most. In that mine, they had a very long haul between their northwest blind shaft and the 900-foot level of their main shaft. In fact, through the late 1890s, access to the ore body in the Long Tunnel Company's northwestern ground was becoming increasingly difficult. A description of the Long Tunnel's arduous journey to the working face was given in the Argus in 1899. All miners had to walk 580 feet in through the main adit to the machinery chamber, where they waited for cages to take them down in turns to level 9. From there they walked 2,288 feet to the machinery chamber of the northwest blind shaft, and again waited to be taken down to their level, where they then walked to the working face to finally get started for their shift. Ore was taken out the same way, being hauled up the blind shaft, trucked all the way back to the main shaft, hauled up again and then trucked out the adit to be taken to the mill. This was time-consuming and expensive. The northwest blind shaft was abandoned at the turn of the 20th century, while the company considered ways to overcome the problem. Something had to be done to better access the northwestern ground, and this would ultimately result in one of Australia's greatest feats of underground mining engineering. The Long Tunnel Company considered sinking a shaft from the surface into their northwestern ground, but it would be very costly to do, and ore would be raised from underground a long way from their mill. Amalgamation was considered with the Long Tunnel Extended, who occupied the space in the middle. This would have solved several problems for both mines, but terms were not agreed on and the amalgamation didn't eventuate. So the Long Tunnel Company devised a grand plan. Inspired by a mine in South Africa, they decided to sink a very long incline shaft straight through the lower portion of the Long Tunnel Extended's lease to reach their ground on the other side. This incredible shaft was designed by a consulting engineer, Lawrence Grayson, and based on the known trend of the reef, it was estimated that at an angle of 49 degrees, it would reach the lode at a distance of 5,000 feet and a vertical depth of 3,800 feet. Sinking this shaft was going to generate a whole lot of mullock, and they had their sights set on a place to dump it, an area which was partially occupied by the old Walhalla Company's battery, the very mill which had been processing the Long Tunnel Extended's ore for over 2 decades. So now it was time for it to go. To save time, the shaft was to be sunk from 2 points simultaneously. Section 1 would begin at the surface from a point above the Long Tunnel's mill. Meanwhile, Section 2 would begin from the 900-foot level. If their calculations were correct, and if all went well, the two would join up seamlessly and they'd continue sinking onwards. The Long Tunnel Extended Company did not want the Long Tunnel Company putting this shaft through their lease, but despite their objections to the Minister of Mines, sinking on Section 1 commenced in December 1902, and Section 2 began soon after. All timber and material for Section 2 was delivered through the adit and main shaft, and mullock was hauled out the same way. The two sections were connected in early 1904, and they were aligned perfectly. Sinking resumed soon after, now with direct haulage to the surface. At 2,880 feet, they stopped sinking to cross-cut to the reef. Then from here, they began hauling out ore while they continued working on the incline shaft. Once the shaft reached a distance of around 4,000 feet, they realised they were approaching the lode much sooner than they had expected. The westerly underlie of the reef had lessened unexpectedly below the vertical depth of 2,000 feet, which meant their calculations had been off. The nature of the ground as they approached the reef caused timbers to be crushed and misaligned. It was not safe to continue sinking with the current inclination. Instead, in a move that truly demonstrated the company's innovation and adaptability, they decided to sink vertically from this point on, keeping the shaft at a safe distance to the east of the reef. Mining operations were suspended for a month while they put in the curve to connect the incline to the vertical shaft. They planned to put their custom-built skips over this curve, carrying the precious cargo of miners and ore, sending them from the incline to the vertical and vice versa. At considerable speed, I must add. Miners were to be sent down into the darkness at a rate of 4.6 meters a second. Guards were fitted in order to prevent the wheels from lifting off as the skips went over. From the first time the skips went over the curve until the closure of the mine, this all worked perfectly. The Long Tunnel Company had successfully put in their innovative shaft, seamlessly transitioning from incline to vertical along the way, with a total distance of 4,640 feet. Miners were being delivered into the depths of the earth a group at a time, and ore was being hauled directly to the surface above their mill from the deepest reaches of their northwestern ground. What a monumental accomplishment for the Long Tunnel Company. An interesting description of the descent down this incline shaft was given in the Gippsland Mercury in 1914. The descent is made on skips which run along rails, and at first the ride is a weird experience. "Mind the curve," shouts the guide of the party, a familiar cry on the suburban tramcars, but one does not grasp its meaning until the skip, still speeding downwards, gently tilts from its angle of 50 degrees into an upright position, and the passengers, instead of reclining on their backs, find it necessary to stand. A somewhat difficult task in the crowded and swiftly moving skip. Today, you can visit the site of the incline shaft, where you'll get an up-close look at an interesting modern headframe. In the 1980s, the collar was rebuilt and the shaft was recovered to a considerable depth, part of an intensive underground development and exploration project. Access into the long-hidden underground levels of the famous Long Tunnel mine was regained, an incredible accomplishment and a fascinating chapter in the history of Walhalla. This modern headframe stands in the space once occupied by the Long Tunnel's earlier wooden headframe, and we can still see the very old foundations on the hillside for the winding gear which was used to haul miners, mullock and ore from underground. Back to 1903. With the Long Tunnel Company's removal of the old Walhalla battery, the Long Tunnel Extended Company needed to build their own mill, something they'd managed to get away without for over 2 decades. Site preparation began, and through a contract with Morgan Brothers, 5,000 cubic yards of dirt was excavated from the hillside beneath the mine. A huge ore crushing and processing plant was constructed and given a grand opening, during which Mrs. Noble, the manager's wife, broke a bottle of champagne over the flywheel and named the new mill Pride of the Mountains. The Long Tunnel Extended's mill was set here, and we can still see remains of foundations down the side of the hill. Ore processing plants were often built down hillsides, as crushed rock needed to pass through several stages of processing, and for this, gravity was a huge advantage. Machinery was placed at different levels, and ore moved to each successive stage more easily when it was being moved downhill. This reduced the need to lift material throughout the process, saving power and labour. Because of this, whether built on a hillside or not, old processing mills typically had this distinctive sloping shape, with the tall stamp batteries raised up at one end. This shape was demonstrated in mills ranging from small battery sheds all the way up to massive processing plants. Now, the machinery in the Long Tunnel Extendeds mill was driven by a Corliss-type tandem compound steam engine, with the steam supplied by 2 Cornish boilers 18 feet long. Inside the shed there was a 20-head battery, copper amalgamation tables, Halley tables, Wilfley tables, Watson and Denny grinding pans, and canvas strakes. We're going to take a closer look at some of these machines, and to help with this, we're heading over to Maldon, a gorgeous old mining town not far from Bendigo, to visit the old State Gold Battery and the Maldon Vintage Machinery and Museum. This shed houses a stamp battery and a Wilfley table, 2 of the machines used in the Long Tunnel Extendeds mill. And not only this, we are fortunate enough to have been provided with footage of Jack Cox demonstrating the operation of this battery and table, filmed in the 1980s by Elaine and Len Appleton. So I'll hold on to that footage for later, and now head to the Maldon Vintage Machinery and Museum, a brilliant place to visit, where there is an absolute treasure held in the archives. Thompson's is a familiar name which can be found stamped on machinery all over the goldfields. This room houses a huge collection of work records, technical drawings and glass plate negatives from Castlemaine's famous Thompson's foundry. Here we can discover records and plans of countless machines and fittings which were commonplace in gold mines and processing mills across Victoria. A look through the beautifully handwritten work records reveals many jobs which were completed for the Long Tunnel Gold Mining Company. But here's what we're after today. These brilliant glass plate negatives give us detailed examples of some of the machinery which was used at the Long Tunnel Extendeds mill, including stamp batteries, Halley tables and Cornish boilers. So now that we've got some great examples from the archives, let's head back to Walhalla and take a look at the processes and machinery inside the Long Tunnel Extendeds mill. The ore to be treated was brought to the mill by tramway, which ran out of the adit and around this hillside. There it was put through rock crushers over an ore bin which could hold 400 tonnes. Automatic feeds then brought the broken ore under the operation of the stamp battery. The Long Tunnel Extendeds battery was built and erected by Roberts and Sons of Bendigo. 4 new 5-head batteries were independently belt-driven to operate at 96 to 100 6-inch drops a minute, with stamps weighing a whopping 500 kilos each. The battery had a crushing capacity of 1,600 tonnes a month. Ore was pulverised to a sand fine enough to pass through the screens at the front of the mortar boxes, and was then washed over 12-foot-long copper plate amalgamating tables, which were coated in mercury. Jack Cox demonstrated this process brilliantly at the Maldon Battery in 1987. So let's take a look.
I am Jack Cox, and for much of my life I lived at Friars Road, Chewton, and attended the Chewton State School. For over 40 years now I have operated the Mines Department battery situated in various parts of the state. I'm the 3rd generation batteryman, and my grandfather, who was both blacksmith and batteryman, operated in various mines throughout the state and also ended up with the Mines Department. My father started with the Mines Department in the mid-1930s, working the government battery on the top of Specimen Hill at Chewton. I still travel around the state working for the Mines Department and operating the batteries. been tipped into the ore bin up the back there. It is then fed into this battery. Now the battery is made up of 5 stands that go up and down at the rate of around about 85 times a minute. We add mercury to this water box, and as the stands crush the stone and release the gold becomes coated with mercury. The big pieces of gold stay inside this water box, but the crushed up pieces of quartz and the fine pieces of gold are washed by the water through these battery screens and over the sheets of copper. Each morning, before starting to crush, the plates have to be dressed with mercury so that they'll readily catch the gold. To do this, what we do is pour the mercury over the plate and coat the sheet of copper with the liquid mercury. After doing this, the plate's in an ideal situation to catch the gold. Because the battery screens have 400 holes to the square inch, means the quartz crushed is very fine when it comes out over the copper plates. Here is an example of the crushed quartz coming out as battery sand.
From the copper plate tables, the fine sands pass through a succession of machines in order to concentrate any heavy material, including any free gold which had escaped the action of the battery and amalgamating tables. This is the Halley percussion table, a machine which works by agitating the ore as it passes over the table, allowing separation and concentration of the material. Halley tables were incline tables 8 feet long by 4 feet wide with adjustable inclination. A 3-armed cam provided a bumping action as the agitator. From there, the ore was passed over Wilfley tables, another type of concentrating machine. And again, Jack Cox has provided a brilliant demonstration.
The sand and mineral, after it leaves the battery, is washed on the head of this concentrating table. It then runs over these slats. You can see there are channels in between each slat, and the sand runs out over these slats in a manner such. The sand, after it's been run over these slats, finally comes to this lip here, runs over the lip, and it's carried out by the action of the water down through this launder, straight out into the tailor pits outside the battery building. Now, the backwards and forwards action of the table separates the mineral, which is heavy in the sand, from the sand by dropping it into these channels. And the action of the table is such that it keeps working that mineral forward all along those channels. The mineral, as it's being settled into these grooves, is worked forward by the action of the table. It starts up there as a little width there and gets wider and wider as more of these channels feed the mineral into it, until finally it comes down here, where this finger separates the sand from the mineral. The mineral goes into the trough, and the sand comes over here into this section here, where the water washes it outside into the sand pit.
When these tables were developed in the late 19th century, they became an immediate success and were widely used in ore processing operations. The Wilfley table incorporated the successful properties of other types of concentrating machinery into one device and was capable of treating coarse sands down to slimes of almost impalpable fineness. This modern shed stands on the site of the Long Tunnel Extended's mill and holds the interesting remains of a Wilfley table. Roberts & Sons also installed 4 Watson & Denny grinding and amalgamating pans to further treat the battery sands after the Wilfley tables. These were driven by a separate steam engine. The heavy concentrates recovered from the previous machines were finely ground with mercury in these amalgamating pans in order to extract any free gold. Last of all, the very fine material was passed over canvas strakes. The Long Tunnel Extended's mill saved a huge amount in crushing costs, reducing from the 9 shillings per tonne which had been paid to the Long Tunnel Company to an estimated cost of 3 shillings 6 pence a tonne. Mining continued, reaching a depth of 923 metres. Unfortunately, by the close of 1909, the mine's end was in sight. Because of the underlie of the reef and the dimensions of the mine's lease, the length situated within the boundary of the Long Tunnel Extended's ground was quickly diminishing with depth. Panic was setting in among the shareholders as share prices plummeted. Perhaps the proposed amalgamation with the neighbouring Long Tunnel mine a few years earlier would have been a good idea after all. At the end of 1909, the battery was only crushing for 1 shift. Then during 1911, the battery stood silent, and that silence must have been deafening to the shareholders. After a long and productive run, the pumps were finally stopped in August 1911, and the company was wound up soon afterwards. But the Long Tunnel Extended had a record to be proud of. From 1871 until 1911, this mine produced a whopping 13.695 tonnes of gold. They had held an incredibly rich portion of Cohen's Reef, and dividends amounting to £788,640 were paid to the shareholders over the lifetime of the mine. Between 1885 and 1908, the Long Tunnel Extended was one of Australia's principal gold producers and was top Victorian producer for 6 of those years. This mine was second in Walhalla only to the famous Long Tunnel mine, from which the Long Tunnel Extended had taken its name. Machinery was auctioned off, and the neighbouring Long Tunnel mine, as well as purchasing the rock drill spares, took over the lease of the Long Tunnel Extended. Work continued here for a few more years, but it wasn't long before operations ceased for good, the workings on Cohen's Reef having reached a final depth of 1,120 metres. While the glory days of Walhalla's gold mines came to an end over 100 years ago, mineral exploration continued in Walhalla through modern times. With the price of gold currently sitting at around $3,000 an ounce, perhaps the story is not over yet. The underground footage filmed for this video would not be possible if it weren't for the generous hospitality of the folks at the Long Tunnel Extended gold mine, and for this I am very grateful. You can visit them for a guided underground tour, and I cannot recommend this tour enough. Here you'll enjoy a unique experience where you can immerse yourself in history and venture into the dark reaches of this significant gold mine. The knowledgeable and passionate tour guides walk you through the mine's fascinating features and give you a glimpse into what life was like for the miners who worked here over a century ago. You'll explore the underground passages through which over 13 tonnes of gold was delivered from the depths of the earth, and you'll stand in a section of the huge underground machinery chamber with 8.5 kilometres of workings in the ground beneath your feet. I'll put a link to their website in the description below, where you'll find tour times, online bookings, and more information about the mine. Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to see more like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.